Monica, Rachel, Phoebe, Ross, Chandler, Joey. Anybody know these friends? Maybe the most famous friends we've ever known. No one told you life was gonna be this way. All right, okay, the 6 p.m. one, but you guys beat the 9:30 in the clap. So there you go. You can take that for the weekend. But who would say that this 6 set of friends is probably the most famous friends worldwide? Because when the TV show Friends aired 25 years ago, it was an instant success. And why? Well, sure, there were fantastic characters, amazing acting, interesting dialogue, great fashion, and great hair. I did have the Rachel, in case you were wondering. I did rock the Rachel. But really, the show tapped into something deeper, something that was happening in culture, the redefinition of friends as family. An article by the British Broadcasting Corporation explained that Friends tapped into a cultural phenomenon where friends became like family. Now, in the very first episode, it tells us that it's called the one where Monica gets a roommate. Rachel Green, she bursts through the doors of Central Perk in her wedding dress, having just left her fiance, Barry, at the altar, where she has escaped domestication, married at the age of 24 to a man she did not love, in search of an alternative life in the big city. And in that episode, the friends gather around Rachel while she cuts up her credit cards paid for by her father, symbolic of her cutting ties with her family. And Monica says, "Welcome to the real world. It's terrible. You're gonna love it." And from there, the show Friends tells us exactly what it's gonna be about. It is about 6 friends who operate as a family, who navigate life and relationships and careers together. And the cultural phenomenon of friends as family has really developed over the last couple of centuries as people have moved away from their family of origin more and more, and when people are waiting longer to get married. So my husband and I, we are part of this statistic. We moved here in 2008 from Alabama, and our closest biological relative is 10 hours away. And so our friends here, our community very much functions as our family. And this trend is responsible for emergence of holidays like Friendsgiving and Galentine's Day, and it has coined the phrase bromance. Our friend relationships have become more important to us than ever before. And one of the most groundbreaking studies about the importance of friendships and relationships in our life has been conducted by Harvard. It's called the Harvard Longevity Study. It is the only one of its kind. So what Harvard did in 1938 is they began following the lives of 268 men at a time when Harvard was only open for men to attend. And they chose 2 groups of men. The first group of men graduated college during World War II, and most went off to serve in the war. And the other group of men came from the poorest neighborhoods of Boston, from troubled and disadvantaged areas. And now they have followed these men for more than 80 years. And they have thousands of pages of research about their lives. They have studied their health trajectory and their broader life as a whole, their careers, their friendships, their relationships, their marriages. And the results have been surprising. Robert Waldinger, director of the study, a psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital and a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, says that the surprising finding is that our relationships and how happy we are in our relationships has a powerful influence on our health. Taking care of your body is important, but tending to your relationships is a form of self-care too. And that, I think, is the revelation. It turns out that people who are more socially connected to family, to friends, to community are happier, they're physically healthier, and they live longer than people who are less well connected. Our relationships and our friendships are crucial to our overall well-being. So we're in a series right now called Better Than Ever, where we have been looking at areas of our lives that have been affected by the pandemic. And we've been asking the question, should we just try to return to normal? Or are there lessons that we've learned through the pandemic that we can apply to areas of our lives to make them better than ever as we move forward? And today, we're talking about friendships. Now, friendships are tricky. They can be difficult to navigate. It's very common that in your late teens and in your 20s that relationships and friendships can be a bit transient. And we know that while friendships can be life-giving and affirming and encouraging and a huge part of who we are, they can also bring about great pain and hurt and conflict. I think we all know what it's like to have our best effort at friendships not work out, or to be vulnerable or transparent with someone to make a connection only to be rejected or forgotten or cast aside and be left feeling lonelier, emptier than before. I know for me, I can look over the history of my relationships and know that I've made a lot of mistakes. A lot of regrets that I've made in friendships and friends that I've lost along the way. Muhammad Ali has actually written a book on friendship, and he says this. He says that friendship is the hardest thing in the world to explain. It's not something that you learn in school, but if you haven't learned the meaning of friendship, you really haven't learned anything. In the Bible, it introduces us to an interesting set of friends who know the highs and lows of friendship well. There are things that they get right about friendship, and well, there are things that they get wrong about friendship. And today I want to talk about this set of friends and see what we can learn from them to make our friendships better than ever. And so this set of friends are found in the book of Job in the Old Testament. Now, the book of Job is centered around a man named Job, who the Bible tells us is righteous because he is upright and blameless before God and he stays away from evil. We find out that Job is a family man, that he is a man of prayer, but he is also a man of great wealth. It tells us that he is the greatest man in the East. And then Job faces a crisis. He faces a trial. And through a series of unthinkable events, Job loses everything. His possessions and his livestock are destroyed or stolen. His children are killed in an accident. He loses his family, and he suffers a great physical illness, a skin disease. And he finds himself in a place of deep emotional and physical pain and suffering. And it is in this suffering that Job's friends arrive on the scene. Job 2, chapter 1 says that when Job's friends Eliphaz the Temite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite heard all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep out loud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled the dust on their heads. And then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. And no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. And here's what Job's friends get right about friendship. They heard, they came, and they empathized with him. Now, the Bible tells us not only the name of Job's friends, but it identifies where they came from, what tribe or village they belonged to. And so we know that the friends would have had to travel a great distance to be with Job, or where we believe Job was located. And so it tells us that despite the distance, Job's friends stayed connected to him. They were able to hear the news that Job was suffering. And we don't know how they heard the news, but we know that they weren't too busy in their own lives. They weren't so wrapped up in their lives in the distance that they weren't willing or able to be connected to Job. And it says when they heard the news, they immediately made plans to go and see Job. These men would have sacrificed greatly to travel to see Job. They would have left behind friends. They were left behind families and businesses and livelihoods and had great expense to come and see Job. But when they heard the news that their friend was suffering, they came the distance to see Job. And now this pandemic, especially at the beginning, it shifted the way that we were able to stay connected to our relationships. In the beginning, as most people tried to isolate and form smaller groups, we began to connect with our friends mainly through text and FaceTime and that occasional awkward Zoom that we held together socially. But then even as things have begun to return somewhat to normal, there is still a phenomenon that's been happening. We have lost a lot of our shared social spaces. So for a lot of people, they're not back in work all the time in person. And so you've lost that lunch hour with that casual friend that you enjoyed going to lunch with. Or you've lost those after work drinks with a friend for happy hour. Or you've lost time at the gym where you used to run into a person who you casually had a conversation with that you would have considered a friend. And so the loss of these shared social spaces, they have revealed something about our friendships. They have revealed which relationships are built on genuine friendship and which relationships crumbled when the structure of convenience was removed. Casual friendships have suffered a great loss. In fact, they're finding now that even as we begin to return to normal, that may not mean that your circle of friends looks the same as it did before. We're finding that social networks of people are smaller than they ever have been before, that friend turnover has been high, and that casual friends are the most vulnerable to being replaced. So Robin Dunbar is a well-known British anthropologist who is responsible for something called the Dunbar number. Now, the Dunbar number tests to see how many relationships a person can hold or be actively involved to based on extensive tests. And what Dunbar found is that we are able to have a circle of about 5 closest relationships. That's 5 people who know us well and we know them and we're involved in their daily lives. And then from there, he says we have a circle of about 15 that we would consider best friends, or he calls them the super family. They may not be quite as close as the 5, but we know a lot about them. And then it extends from there, but he says that 150 is the tipping point. That's the number. That's the number of people that you can know in your life before you get to that guy right there that says, dang, what was their name again? I have been that person a lot. In fact, we just sent my boys to a new school, and they had like a back to school picnic for the new families. And when we came in, they had us all put on name tags. And when we got back in the car, one of my kids said, man, would it be nice if like every day, everywhere we went, people wore name tags? That would take off the pressure of me trying to remember everybody's name. I can get behind, I really can get behind that. But we are limited people, and there's limited number of relationships that we can invest in closely. Now, extroverts and introverts, that's gonna look different. Extroverts tend to spread themselves more thin over a lot of people, and introverts tend to have a smaller pool of people, but with deeper investment. And Jesus, if you think about his life, he's an example of this. He had a closest inner circle of James and Peter and John, and then he had 12 disciples. And then from there, he had more disciples who followed along with him that we remain unnamed in the Bible. And then he had hundreds of people and thousands of people who followed him. Now, over the years, people have disputed or pushed against Dunbar's number and said, no, it's more like 3, 4, any variety of numbers around there, but the concept has remained the same because we are limited people with limited time to invest in other people. And Job's friendships, they weren't a matter of convenience. His friends gave Job the thing that is the most valuable thing that we can give a friend: time. Job's friends gave him time. They came when they heard what was wrong, and they invested in him, and they gave time in him. And because we all have the same number of hours in a day, we all have to choose what is important. And if we want deep and lasting relationships, we have to find ways to be involved and to give our friends time to be in their lives. So I formed most of my closest friendships in my 30s. And most of those, well, all of those have been formed through church. And my very best friend I met in preaching class years ago at my last church. We served on the same ministry staff together, but I didn't really know her very well until this class. And over the course of a few months, we began to develop a friendship, talking about the sermons we were writing and what we were learning in God's word and how stressful and nerve-wracking and terrible we were. And we really had an instant connection. Now, we are very different. She comes from a very different background of origin. She has a very different personality than me, but we bonded over this desire to understand God's word and to communicate it. And just as this new friendship was really beginning to flourish and become important to both of us, God called her family to London overseas as missionaries for 3 years. And we were both really sad because we assumed that distance would be the end of our new relationship. And at first we experienced a lot of challenges having an ocean between us. We tried FaceTime, we tried phone calls, but with the time difference, we hardly ever were able to catch each other. And then we discovered this app called Marco Polo. Do I have any Marco Poloers out there? Just a few? This app called Marco Polo, where instead of texting, you send video messages essentially back and forth. And what we found is that we were able to do that. We were able to talk about our daily lives and ask questions to each other. And I would send her a video. And then by the time I would wake up in the morning, she would have already replied. And so through this series of messages over 3 years, we built our friendship through long distance. We got to know each other. We began to talk about what we struggled with. And she became one of the most important people in my life. And she was there through some of the darkest days of my depression, my surgery, and I supported her as she lived overseas as a missionary with 2 small children in a city that was very expensive. And even though they're now back in the States, we still communicate almost daily through that app. And so we are limited people with limited time, and sometimes we have to get really creative and intentional with the ways that we keep invested in the daily lives of the people who are closest to us, because those relationships matter. And Job's friends, they heard from a distance what was going on in Job's life, and then they came to him. And then it says that when the friends came, that when they saw him from a distance, that they could hardly recognize him. And they began to weep out loud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. And then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. Job's friends, they grieved with him. They had sorrow for him. They saw the condition that he was in, and they wept with him, and they sat with him, and they commiserated with him, and they showed great empathy towards Job's situation. And I don't know if you know this or not, but our society is currently in what they call a cultural crisis of empathy. You can Google it if you want to research more about it. Cultural crisis of empathy will get you thousands of pages of research, dozens of books that have been written on this topic. But you can do your own research if you want to, and you can go to the comment section on a Facebook post from any major news article and look for empathy. And I bet that you will determine without a lot of research that we are in a cultural crisis of empathy. And what is empathy? Empathy is our ability to share and understand one another's feelings. It is a psychological superglue that connects people, and it's undergirded by kindness. It is measured by asking people how much they care about others, how they mimic another's feelings or pain, and how accurately they can overlap someone else's experiences on their own. And so the most common measure of empathy is a standard questionnaire that has been asked to hundreds of thousands of people since the late 1970s. And over the last few years, particularly in the 21st century, psychologists have found a steep drop in empathy. The average American is scoring 75% less empathetic than people scored in 1979. And why is empathy so important? Because empathy goes against this instinct to divide people into us and them. Empathy is so important because it helps us understand people other than us. It helps us fight against this narrative that says me first, or to define experiences just by my own. And empathy is crucial for us as followers of Jesus to be able to live out the great commandment to love our neighbors. Empathy is a huge part of what we need, but for many of us, we have become dry-eyed. And I get it. We have seen so much destruction and disaster and suffering that in a lot of ways we become desensitized to it. And it would do us a lot of good to be like Job's friends and weep at the distress of others, or like Jesus when he wept at the tomb of Lazarus. And here's the fascinating thing about empathy. Empathy is not like, say, your height, like your adult height. You get there, you can't change it. Empathy actually can be increased and decreased. Empathy can be encouraged and discouraged. We can actually grow in empathy. So I'm going to give you 4 quick ways that you can grow your empathy. And the first is this: you can become more empathetic by making curiosity a habit. Make curiosity a habit. Don't make assumptions about people. Instead, want to know more about people. Ask more questions instead of making statements. Be curious about what people think and what they believe and things about them, and be open to the idea that you might be wrong about an assumption that you had made. Be curious about people. And the second one is this: widen your circle to people who are different than you. Our tendency is to invest in people closest to us who look like us, think like us, believe like us, and live like us. And one of the ways that we become empathetic is by learning about the experiences of people who are different than us. So when we invest in people, when we widen our circles to intentionally include people who are different, we grow to understand a different person's viewpoint, even if we don't agree. So here it is. Make curiosity a habit. Widen your circle to people different than you. And the third one is commit to being a learner. Read books, watch documentaries, watch movies written or filmed by people from various and different backgrounds. It is a very cool time that we live in. We have never had so much access to resources from all around the globe like we have today, like TED Talks and documentaries where we can really see what it's like for people who live all over the globe. In fact, this morning I just tagged a TED Talk that came by from a woman from Afghanistan that I want to watch this week. Because when we expose ourselves and we learn and we commit to being a learner, and then we begin to grow in our empathy and understand what it's like to live or experience something different than us. So make curiosity a habit. Widen your circle to people who are different from you. Commit to being a learner. And lastly, become a listener. Like a really good listener. Let people share their thoughts and feelings and ideas and beliefs without feeling like you have to jump in and respond. There's a difference between listening to understand and listening to respond. And how we listen in our friendships can be just as important, if not more important, than what we say in our friendships. So Job's friends, they get it right. They hear, they stay invested, they sacrifice their time, they come and they empathize with him. And if they had just stopped there, if they had just sat in the silence with Job, we would be hailing them today as a great example of friendship. But they didn't. They started talking and things go south. And this is where we get to learn what Job's friends got wrong about friendship. So what Job's friends get wrong about friendship is they offered condemnation instead of compassion. After their silence, Job's friends began to speak to Job. And rather than offering words of compassion about his suffering and his situation, they began to condemn him. Over the course of the book of Job, there are 3 cycles of conversation between Job's friends and Job. And in these conversations, Job's friends make barbed accusations that question Job's faith and his character and his knowledge. And as much as Job tries to defend himself against the words of his friends, the pain of his friends' accusation only compounds the suffering that he has felt because of his emotional and physical distress. Job's friends condemned him instead of offering compassion. And this pandemic that we're in has been both an individual and a shared experience of stress, fear, anxiety, change, pain. And with that has come new experiences that none of us have ever had before. And that causes us to shape new beliefs and new ideas and new opinions. Ones that can put us and have put us at odds with people that we've always agreed with. It has created disagreement in relationships where it has never existed before. For example, if someone loses a loved one to COVID, it becomes really difficult for them to stay in a close relationship with a friend who believes that COVID is overblown. And everybody has arrived at the place where they think is best, and everyone has coped different, and everybody thinks that they're the ones who are right. And what should have brought us together as a people and made us compassionate towards one another because of this experience that we are sharing, instead has made us quick to condemn people for their choices. We have not offered as much compassion as we have condemnation. And what I'm afraid that has happened is that relationships have begun to suffer because we cannot agree. And while social media and digital relationships, to their credit, have the ability to keep us connected, their downfall is they give us a place that could potentially cause division or hurt people or wreck real life friendships. In the Old Testament, friendship is described to us in a variety of ways, as a counselor, as a neighbor, as a close companion. And in the structure of Israel, a friend stands somewhere between a brother and a neighbor. Proverbs 18:24 tells us that there are persons for companionship, but then there are friends who are more loyal than family. And a friend is based on loyalty. It's a word that means in the Bible, it's called hesed. And what it means is a faithful, loving, loyal kindness. Friendship should be based on, and it is in the Old Testament, based on this deep concern for each other that transcends and goes beyond clashes of personality or degree or disagreement. It's a covenant relationship. An example of this type of friendship is Jonathan and David, when in 1 Samuel 18:1 says that their souls were knit together in love. It is a deep loyalty for our friend that it's more than courtesy or friendliness or sociability. It is a commitment to a person and a relationship, and it calls for a type of love that goes beyond convenience and disagreement and moves towards practical care and compassion. And what I'm afraid has been happening in friendships is that we've lost our ability to be empathetic and we've become quicker to condemn than to offer compassion. And by far the greatest tragedy of COVID is the loss of human life. But I think what can compound that and another casualty would be the loss of deep, meaningful friendships because we can't agree. And our friendships should transcend disagreement and go into like a loyal love for each other. And what God does is God does intervene in this situation with Job and his friends. He shows up in chapter 38. He says, "Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind and said, 'Who is this darkening counsel with words lacking knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man, and I will interrogate you, and you will respond to me.'" Y'all listen, if God shows up in a whirlwind and tells you to prepare yourself like a man, that he's going to interrogate you, it's not good. It is not going to go well for you. Prepare yourself like a man. I'm going to interrogate you. I almost feel like I should use that with my husband. But once God rebukes the friends and speaks to Job, I think God does something in this passage that's really important for us today. He said, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, he said to Eliphaz from Teman, "I am angry at you and your two friends because you haven't spoken about me correctly, as did my servant Job. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and prepare an entirely burnt offering for yourselves. Job, my servant, will pray for you, and I will act favorably by not making fools of you because you didn't speak correctly, as did my servant Job." So Eliphaz from Teman, Bildad from Shuah, and Zophar from Nemah did what the Lord told them, and the Lord acted favorably towards Job. And then the Lord changed Job's fortune when he prayed for his friends, and the Lord doubled all Job's earlier possessions. So God asked Job to pray for his friends. And God gives Job's friends a pathway to forgiveness, a sacrifice, a way for him to be restored to God, but also to be restored to Job. Because embedded in God's request that Job pray for his friends is that Job forgive his friends. And in the end, God restores not only Job's physical condition and his possessions, but he restores their relationship. He returns them back to his tight-knit community. And the promise of the gospel is unconditional forgiveness that calls us to a vision of friendship that goes beyond culture's tendency to take offense or alienate or discard people who hurt us or disagree with us. God restores their friendship through prayer and through forgiveness, and God can do the same thing with our friendships. So as we close today and you think about your friendships, is there someone that you need to pray for today and forgive? Or is there someone that you need to pray for today and then ask for forgiveness? Because we're like Job's friends. And sometimes we'll get it right. Sometimes we'll get it wrong. But if we stay connected into the lives of the people who are closest to us, to our friends, and we give of our time and we sacrifice for them and we respond with empathy and compassion, with a heart that's quick to forgive and to pray for our friends, then we truly can have friendships that are better than ever. Let me pray. God, I am moved by the way the Bible describes your love for us as a faithful, loving, loyal kindness towards us. That God, no matter how many times we get it wrong, no matter how many times we fail, that like Job's friends, you will forgive and restore us, that you made a way for that forgiveness and restoration through the sacrifice of your son, Jesus. And so God, right now, I confess that I get it wrong a lot, that I am quick to judge or quick to condemn or hold unforgiveness in my heart. So God, I'd ask that for me and for anyone here that recognizes that in themselves today, God, that you would forgive us. And God, I pray if there's people that we need to forgive, if there are relationships that need restoration or healing, if there's bitterness or anger or resentment in anyone's heart, God, because of hurt that they've experienced from a friend, God, I pray that you would release us from that and that you would heal that and that you would give us the grace and the love, God, to love people in our lives and forgive and to pray for our friends, even if we disagree or they hurt us. And God, I want to thank you. Thank you for your word that promises to us that when we come to you, you forgive us. So God, make us a people who responds like Jesus did when it says that he moved with compassion towards the suffering of people. Give us hearts full of empathy and compassion for our fellow human being. God, help us love people the way that you love us. We pray these things in your son's name today. Amen.